Good evening. I'm attorney Lawrence Berliner. I'm an attorney in the field of special education law, and I'm here with our co-host, Jane Faherty, who's the director of the Stamford Jewish Community Center JumpStart program. We have a special guest this evening, Susanne Bailey-Rice, who we'll get to in a few moments. After a few preliminary announcements, Jane will introduce herself, go over some topics she would like to discuss, and then we'll get to tonight's speaker. I have a disclaimer. The webinar is being recorded, so those who have registered, the webinar is being recorded, and those who would like a copy of the webinar, it will be available to you after tonight's meeting. The information provided during the webinar does not constitute specific legal advice to you and your child and should not be relied upon as such. The webinar does not establish an attorney-client relationship with myself, attorney Lawrence Berliner. It doesn't establish a professional relationship with Jane Faherty or our guest this evening, Susanne Bailey-Rice. By signing up, you've agreed to receive additional information in the form of announcements for future webinars from either the Stamford Jewish Community Center and or the Law Office of Lawrence Berliner. Please note that Zoom is a third-party provider, is not an agent of or associated with the Law Office of Lawrence Berliner, Jane Faherty, JumpStart, Stamford JCC, or Susanne Bailey-Rice. We note that some of our attendees this evening, and we have quite a few, and are from other states, and on occasion we have people from other countries. Our webinar is based upon issues and laws arising within the state of Connecticut. So while we're dealing with a federal law called the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, there are variations within each state on how that law is implemented. So please check your own state's law and policies for specific guidance. Jane and I are continuing to present these Zoom webinars. Jane and I have been doing this, I guess it's 3 years now, which is hard to believe because we are dedicated professionals, parents, and others who are concerned in a community of concerned citizens who are still learning how to navigate this never-ending pandemic and the ravages of the pandemic. There have been some recent studies showing how children in the past few years have been adversely affected socially, emotionally, and more specifically academically as a result of the pandemic, lost learning opportunities in school, out of school, hybrid learning, etc. We've been moderating a series of webinars to address these issues and issues to come as we will announce our next webinar at the end of tonight's meeting. We have received many questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to all the questions that we've already received, but we'll do our best. One housekeeping note, the webinar is being recorded, so if you put anything in the webinar chat section, it will be recorded. So we ask that to maintain your privacy that you use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and you will be in a position to ask a question. Hopefully you'll be able to answer it, and it won't be recorded. So without further ado, Jane, do you have any announcements? Anything new with you? It's nice to see you.
Hi, it's lovely to be back this evening for this really important topic of dyslexia. I'm not only the executive director for JumpStart, which is a program for toddlers with developmental disabilities located in the Stamford JCC and soon to be a Norwalk location. I also advocate for children in the public schools to make sure that after transitioning into the public school and thereafter they continue to receive the services and the provisions that they need in order to receive a free, appropriate public education. And it's a real pleasure to have Susanne here tonight because reading and literacy has always been a prevalent topic and concern for parents, but increasingly so since COVID. And since, a lot of children and their literary skills have declined, or they are performing below grade level. So I don't really have many things to discuss of late, other than that I know it's parent conferencing time. A lot of parents are going into the schools, they're meeting with their teams, they're hearing how their child is doing. Don't be afraid to use this as a chance to really ask questions and not just be satisfied with the fact that, yes, your child is pleasant, they're lovely to have in the classroom. Really use this as an opportunity to dive a little deeper and find out how they are doing in school, and use this as a time to maybe discuss booking a PPT for in the new year, so you can really take the time to consider the information they provide you with before the holidays, review it with the entire team after the holidays. But other than that, it's a pleasure to be here this evening with both you, Lawrence, and Susan.
Thank you.
Last week was the 47th anniversary of the signing of the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, now known as the Individuals with Disabilities Act. It was signed in 1975 by President Gerald Ford. And for those who work in the field of special education, as teachers, educators, consultants, those who advocate for the rights of students with disabilities, lawyers, non-attorney advocates, this has been a very exciting journey. Much of the original law is still intact after 47 years. There have been additions to the law, changes to the law in response to some court decisions. We've added the Birth to Three program, which wasn't around when this law was signed. We have focused on the transition needs of students who become young adults to make sure that they're properly prepared for life after they either graduate from high school or exit from special education when their eligibility runs out. In Connecticut, there have been many, many changes. And some of those changes started around 2012, 2013, when a group of parents, not educators, but a group of parents coalesced around the issues affecting children with certain kinds of learning disabilities, such as dyslexia and other kinds of specific learning disabilities. And they wanted laws to address those concerns. They wanted resources to address those concerns. They wanted educators to have the resources, training, and hopefully the experience to impart on young children who are struggling with literacy, with reading. And we have started in 2000, I think it was 14, with a definition of dyslexia. Later on, we required the State Department of Education to have resources that are available. Some of them are posted on the chat from the State Department of Education. We've required teachers and new upcoming teachers to know something about language-based learning disabilities while they're still in college and graduate school, to make sure that they are properly prepared when they enter the classroom to help students who are struggling with reading. We have had task force, I think it was last year, the year before, to look at the gains to see if there's, how we're doing so far, or do we need to make changes? Are we going forward? Are we going backwards? And just last week, one of the most recent pieces of legislation was establishing a bureau chief for dyslexia and reading disabilities at the State Department of Education. And just last week, it was announced that the department has hired Dr. Jules McCombs-Tolis, who I've known for many, many years, who was of late at Fairfield University, a professor of special education, as I recall her title there. And she will be working at the State Department of Education as the bureau chief for dyslexia and reading disabilities. So we'll have a point person finally within the department. Dyslexia has been around, as far as I know, forever, whenever we reduce verbal language to written language. Dyslexia, I'll go back one sentence. Any language, whether it's English, French, Greek, Aramaic, any of the ancient languages, they're all based upon a code that we all agree these symbols constitute letters, and these letters have sounds and symbols, and we're supposed to be able to crack the code. Well, the cracking the code in modern times is decoding, and I'm sure our guest tonight will talk about that. Dyslexia has been defined as a specific learning disability. It's a neurobiological in origin. It's characterized by difficulties with accuracy and fluent word recognition, poor spelling, and decoding abilities. And they result from a deficit in phonological component of language. And this is the important part. It's unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. In other words, you have some very talented, smart people who just have a problem with reading. And in preparing for tonight's lecture and webinar, I was reminded of a movie I saw a number of years ago. It was an HBO special, I believe. It was of Ken Burns, the documentary filmmaker, did a film entitled The Address, which was about students at the Greenwood School in Putney, Vermont. And it was about students learning the Gettysburg Address, reciting the Gettysburg Address, spelling out the Gettysburg Address, and eventually giving the address in front of their peers and their families. And it was very, very inspiring to see in the course of this film how students overcame their fears and challenges. And at the very end of the movie, there were a whole bunch of very, very famous, accomplished people who said they had dyslexia, and somehow or other they reached their adulthood with compensatory strategies, and families and others who helped them, because a lot of the strategies that we're going to learn about tonight were not available, or if they were available, they weren't in a public school setting. Sir Richard Branson of Virgin American Airlines and Entertainment, Governor Gavin Newsom of California, David Boyce, who's an attorney who's argued cases at the United States Supreme Court, Whoopi Goldberg, who hasn't heard of Whoopi Goldberg, Henry Winkler, the Fonz, Charles Schwab in financing, John Lennon. Anybody remember John Lennon? Magic Johnson, Ari Emanuel, the author John Irving, just to name a few out of many who are accomplished in their own fields, who have acknowledged publicly that they have dyslexia. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest this evening. I've had the pleasure, and I mean that sincerely, of knowing Susanne Bailey Rice for quite a number of years, first as a teacher and educator, a very dedicated teacher and educator, and then later on as she was acquiring more skills, which I'll get to in a moment, she started to do tutoring and later on evaluations, and now she has a full-time practice located in Guilford, Connecticut. Susanne has a Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology. She has the Educator's Certificate from the State Department of Education. Is it Madison or Guilford? I know you're on the line.
Madison. It's just
Madison,
over
I apologize.
That's okay.
I got a note. I thought it was in Guilford. Never mind. It's right on the Guilford Madison line.
It is. It's right on the line.
Literally.
Yeah.
She was a special education teacher for many years. She's a member of the International Dyslexia Association. She's a member of the Orton Gillingham Academy. She's a member of ASCD, which I have to confess, I don't know that one. She has master's degrees in remedial reading, language arts. She's at the associate level of the Academy of Orton Gillingham. And as I understand, you're working on your practicum and to become the highest level person in Gillingham parlance, which is a fellow, right?
Well, so right now I'm almost to certified, and after that I'll continue and then eventually get to fellow. So yes, that's my plan.
So she's the founder of Shoreline Learning LLC. Contact information is in the chat in Madison, Connecticut. I apologize. And we're very excited to have her this evening to go over topics that I hope our assembled audience will find interesting, useful, and relevant to their own lives and to the lives of the children. So I want to thank Susanne for taking time out of her busy day and schedule to be with us this evening.
Right, thank you very much. It was my pleasure. I was actually very excited when you asked me to do this, because I could talk for hours and hours about dyslexia and students and how we can best support them. So that's why I'm here, and I was very excited to be able to share, and I hope it's helpful. All right, so let's share. Get this up here. Okay, so let me go to presentation mode. All right, so I am a big proponent of making learning fun for students and for a webinar. So I stuck a little cartoon here and there just to kind of bring it back to why we're all here, right? So this is one of my favorites. It's two little ants eating, what they don't know is, and he said, if you ask me, reading is overrated. Now, the one little one that's saying that is eating a can of pesticides. So that is not going to be good for him. So just a cute little, it's brings it back down. So in 2002, the IDA, International Dyslexia Association, created their definition. And I will read it quickly. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin, which Attorney Berliner shared with us. It's characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth in vocabulary and background knowledge. Makes sense, but that's a lot of words to think about. So what is dyslexia in non-legal terms? Just breaking it down, that was a lot of information, a lot of vocabulary put into one place. So, if you're looking at morphology of the word dyslexia, dys often means difficulty. Lexia is often related to words. So it is a difficulty with words. A specific learning disability, like we said, is neurobiological. It's characterized by difficulties with accurate and fluent word recognition, often poor spelling, right? Makes sense. If you can't read the words, if you have difficulty decoding what the words are, chances are you're not going to be spelling them accurately. And students with dyslexia process, they interpret information differently. It's literally how their brain is looking at information. There's some amazing research. I am very much interested in that, and I've heard some amazing speakers of, the actual brain studies through fMRI imaging and watching students read and what their brains are doing. It's amazing. And I would definitely suggest looking that up. And it affects 15 to 20% of our population. So if we're talking about our classrooms, it's 1 in 5 students. So this is not something that's one student here or there. It's a major thing for every classroom, 1 in 5 students. So the training for teachers and parents is so very important so that we can reach all of those students. So this is just an interesting graphic that I really like to include in any speaking that I do, because it breaks down, 5% of students learn to read. It's effortless. It just makes sense. They can look at a text, they can read it. 35% learning to read is relatively easy with broad instruction. So classroom, whole group, they're going to pick up what they need in order to read successfully. 40 to 50% learning to read proficiently requires code-based, explicit, systematic, and sequential instruction. So those are our students. Maybe they're being pulled back to small groups. They really need that instruction. And then 10 to 15%, that's, potentially our dyslexic group that really need that one-on-one pull out instruction to make it make sense for them. It has to be that explicit, systematic, sequential, diagnostic instruction. And that's really what we're going to focus on tonight. What dyslexia is not. This is really important. There's a lot of myths out there that, it's only a vision problem. It's reading backwards. It's writing backwards. While that can occur, right? It can be comorbid. You can have vision problems with dyslexia, but that's not just what it is. It's not a problem of intelligence. And this is what most of my webinar slides are about, is many dyslexic are gifted, they're artistic, they're athletes, they're scientific. Like Attorney Berliner said, there's so many, and I have a slide later about, so many famous people that are dyslexic. Albert Einstein, who we consider to be this genius, right? And he was dyslexic. So knowing that it's not a bad thing, it's not a label, it's not a, it's taking that and kind of shifting it to being empowering. It's not something you outgrow. But with early intervention and appropriate accommodations, literacy outcomes greatly improve. It's not something you cure, and certainly not with, vision therapy, color overlays. It's not just about that. There's a lot more involved. Difficulty due to lack of exposure to instruction. So again, we might see some students when we're doing evaluations, which we'll dig into in a little bit, that maybe they didn't have the instruction and they just need the instruction and they're good to go. And then you have the students that are at the bottom of that grid that we showed that they need the instruction. It's not just that they haven't received it, but it's actually a disability similar to dyslexia. And it's certainly not laziness, because they are working so hard. Probably the hardest working students in any classroom, because they are working above and beyond what everyone is doing, because it's not coming naturally. They need that specific help to make progress. So what are signs? A student who is below grade level reading on written language is a student we need to take a closer look at. Whether or not it's dyslexia, we still need to take a look, because those students need our support. But key things to look for is difficulty with phonological processing, phonemic awareness. That's the very foundation of our literacy skills. Difficulty learning the alphabet. I have students here at Shoreline Learning that are 4 and 5 years old that are really, it's already starting to see those red flags of they don't know their letters. They're not, maintaining the memory of what the letter ID is or what sounds they make. So it can be as early as that. And I'm sure Jane can, mention that as well. It's that early intervention that's key. Difficulty decoding words, especially nonsense words. And I'll get to in a little bit as well, is the compensation skills of students with dyslexia. So sometimes just giving them real words is not enough, because they've memorized so many words. So, those nonsense words are key in figuring out if they just know the word, or if they have memorized the word, or if they really know the skills in order to decode those words. Disfluent or labored reading, poor handwriting, poor spelling, and poor written expression. So those are kind of those areas to keep a look out for. Again, I said I love cartoons. So this is one that says, it's Calvin and Hobbes, an oldie but a goodie. Calvin, your mom and I looked over your report card and we think you could be doing better, but I don't like school. We hear that a lot, right? Why not? You like to read and you like to learn. I know you do. I mean, you've read every dinosaur book ever written and you've learned it a lot, right? Reading and learning are fun. Yeah. So why don't you like school? We don't read about dinosaurs. So, that interest level of, we have to make sure that we're touching that upon kids. So are we teaching them what they need to know? Are they seeing the success of what we're trying to get across? So that leads into the Matthew effect. So you may have heard, the Matthew effect is the more, and when you receive the slides, I think they're in the chat, but I'm not positive, but you will receive all of the slides. There are tons of links that I'm not going to click on through the process, because we want to save room for time for questions and answers. So we want to make sure there's lots of room, but there's a lot of links that go into depth for all of the things that I'm quickly mentioning. But the Matthew effect is, if you have a student that enjoys reading, they enjoy learning, right? They're going to get a lot of practice. They're going to grab books about dinosaurs and they're going to grab as many books as they can. They're going to develop automaticity. They're going to develop prosody, you know, their fluency. They're going to improve their vocabulary. They're going to have a good attitude towards school. They're going to love learning and want to read more and more and more. So all of those skills are just going to keep spiraling up. On the other end, if you have a student where there's no enjoyment in reading, it's a challenge, it's a struggle every time they pick up a book, they don't understand what they're reading, it's hard to get through the words, they're not going to get the practice because they're not picking them up. You know, that silent reading time in a classroom, they're just picking up a chapter book that looks like everyone else's, and they're kind of just skimming the pages. They're not reading the words. So they're not getting that automaticity. They're not getting the fluency. Their vocabulary is not improving. Their attitude towards school is changing. Their emotion is changing, and they're not reading, and it's the downward spiral. So that's the Matthew effect. Students that are doing well in learning and know how to read, they're improving, and the students that aren't are decreasing their excitement about learning. So the areas that, the areas that we really want to look at, the National Reading Panel identified 5 key concepts that are at the core of every effective reading instruction program. We have phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. So since the panel's report was released in 2000, these concepts have now been considered the 5 pillars of literacy and reading instruction. So phonemic awareness is the ability to identify the different sounds that make up speech. So things at home that you would be doing or that we should do in the classrooms, word games, rhyming, tongue twisters, anything that's matching the sounds. So it's really all about the sounds. When you jump to phonics, it's when you're putting the sounds together with the letters. So they're starting to see that letter ID. Again, rhyming, but books like Sam I Am did not like green eggs and ham, right? They're seeing the words as they're hearing the rhyming. And that's where it becomes, just to go back, most of our instruction for dyslexic students is going to come here. I mean, usually when we assess them, these are the areas that are lacking. These are where a lot of the gaps are for a lot of our students with splintered skills. The 2 of those will equal our fluency, right? So the fluency is ability to read accurately and quickly. So they don't have to stop and decode all of the words. They don't have to think, and I know vocabulary is next, but they don't have to think about those words. And if they know the vocabulary, they're just fluently reading. Vocabulary is the key to knowing more about everything. You know, that reading is going to give us more vocabulary. I have one student that whenever I hear vocabulary, I automatically think of her she is an amazing decoder. We've done Orton Gillingham together for a very long time now. And her vocabulary is what sticks with her because she can decode any word. She knows the rules. She knows when to use TCH, when to use DGE. But if she doesn't know the vocabulary word, she is reading it correctly, but she's not recognizing it. So she doesn't know that it's correct yet. So she just keeps saying it over and over and trying different things. And I'm like, no, stop, you got it. This is the vocabulary. She's like, well, I don't know that word. I'm like, okay, let's teach it to you. So, you know, sometimes you can have amazing decoding, but you get stuck at the vocabulary. So it's just as important to have that vocabulary as part of our lessons so that we are teaching all 5 pillars of reading. And comprehension is our ultimate goal, right? So we have to know what we're reading. That's the point of having things in writing, is so that we can read them, we can understand them, and ultimately also write them. So suggested assessments. So we need to find out if a student is in fact dyslexic, right? We need to learn who they are as learners. You know, one of my big sticking points is a lot of families or districts that call me to do an evaluation will say, but we just want to know if they're dyslexic. I say, well, I can tell you that, but what's more important to me is, who is this student as a learner? What do they need to be successful? So yes, we will see if they are possibly dyslexic or not, but whether that box is checked on the IEP, to me, it's less important than what does the rest of that IEP say? You know, who are they? What are their strengths? What are their needs for focus for instruction? And how are we delivering that? How often are we delivering that? What is the training of the staff that's delivering that instruction? Is all, to me, much more important than which box is checked. So that's just my little disclaimer of how I feel when I'm doing an evaluation, is what does that look like? So these are the tests that I usually will administer when I'm doing a formal literacy evaluation. So, and I two things I need to know when I start to do an evaluation is what tests have been done within the past year or two. Many of these formal assessments cannot be repeated within 1 year. So if a district has administered some of these assessments within the last year, I cannot redo them until 1 year's time has passed. If it's been done in, a little bit longer than a year, then I get very excited because then I can re-administer it and you can really compare within 1 year's time what has been the growth. So that will determine sometimes which assessments that I give. When I am planning an assessment, that's the first thing I look at. The second thing I try to do is to have at least 2 assessments for each of those 5 pillars. So then you have 2 things to compare. Sometimes tests vary just a little bit in how they're administering it. Is it more oral or are they looking at a list of words? For comprehension, I want to see when they're reading it out loud to me and I'm tracking, their timing and their accuracy, but I also want to see when they're reading silently to themselves. So I really try to have at least 2 assessments for each of those 5 pillars, and then also assessments that I can dig a little deeper. So these are just some list, and I can certainly, if I want to get to the questions and answers so that I can answer everyone's questions. So I don't want to go into detail, but I can certainly, if someone has further questions, feel free to email and I can go into a little bit more detail on them. I also include informal assessments in my formal testing for one major reason is, well, 2. So the first is, some of the informal assessments really allow me to dig a little bit deeper. The formal assessments may give me a score and they give me a lot to write in my narrative, but the informal, especially the GE, which is the Gallistel-Ellis test of coding skills, that gives me a really nice error analysis. When they are reading each type of word, what are they doing? What is their error and why are they making it? So that assessment really lets me dig in to see why they're making their errors, not just a score, comparing them to their peers, but why are they doing that? And how is that going to help our instruction? How is that going to drive what we write on the IEP? So that is a really important informal one. And also the informal assessments allow the district to progress monitor. So the QRI or the BRI have many passages for reading. So you could check their accuracy, their fluency, their comprehension over time, several times. Those are ones that can be administered many times a year. The same with the GE can be administered, maybe September, January, and June, so that you can really see over time how they're progressing with the instruction that they're receiving. So I like to do those formal assessments, even though it's a formal assessment, I like to include those informal because it provides the baseline. So that way, moving forward, the district can do that progress monitoring. That was a long one, I'm sorry. So reading instruction. So some of the vocabulary that we hear everywhere right now, which is exciting for me, is structured literacy and the science of reading. So what are those? So structured literacy, according to the International Dyslexia Association, approaches, my picture is hiding it on me, approaches emphasize highly explicit systematic teaching of all important components. These components include both foundational skills and higher level literacy skills. The structured literacy also emphasizes oral language abilities essential to literacy development, including phonemic awareness, sensitivity to speech, and the ability to manipulate these sounds. So all those 5 pillars in a very explicit, systematic, using a scope and sequence, and really going through to fill those gaps in those splintered skills. The science of reading is all the research around it. So, making sure that we are basing how we are teaching our students in research. What is working? According to the Reading League, which is in my resources at the end, definitely something to be following. They have a national chapter. They also have a Connecticut chapter. The Science of Reading is a vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research about reading and issues related to reading and writing. So if you need to look up any topic, you go to that. And there's some amazing, and I have it at the end, but the Reading League also does a journal, which has some really great information. And I have lots of resources that I could share. So at the end of the day, instruction must be explicit, prescriptive, structured, diagnostic, and based on the science of reading. So any instruction has to follow all of those. I often get the question, well, what do I do, Wilson or Orton Gillingham? So that's a tough one. I mean, they are very, very similar. So I am trained in Orton Gillingham by the Orton Gillingham Academy. I have not trained exclusively in Wilson. I have the 3-day training, which is nothing in the grand scheme of things, but I did want to just have a little exposure to it. And as Larry mentioned, I'm still going in my Orton Gillingham. And once I get there, my next step is Wilson, so that I can really have a solid base in both. You know, Barbara Wilson, who created the Wilson Learning, was one of the people who started the first Orton Gillingham Academy. So she was Orton Gillingham, right? And she took that knowledge and created a program that could be in schools and could really give us the materials that we need to be in classrooms everywhere. It is based on Orton Gillingham. It is the same, very similar structure of a lesson, the same components of a lesson, but it has materials. So that's kind of there's much more, but that's kind of the quick and easy distinction of the two. You know, another big difference is Wilson, you kind of stay on a skill until it's mastered. You know, you have practice and they have, you know, many word lists and things like that, and you stay on it until they master. Or in Gillingham, there's no materials. You are, you know, the teacher that is highly trained is creating the materials based on the individual student. That's the diagnostic part, is you are looking at how every lesson goes and you're planning your next lesson based on those errors and what they need to learn. And I tend, as Orton Gillingham versus Wilson, I tend to move along a little bit quickly, but always cycle those things that are mastered, that are not mastered yet in. So you're kind of keep moving, but keep bringing it in. Whereas Wilson, you stop until you are mastered. So in my opinion, that's kind of the big difference between the two. What can be happening in our classrooms? So outside of the explicit instruction, what can we be doing in every classroom to support our students? Provide auditory, visual, and kinesthetic. That is huge. That's how you're changing brains. You're providing that information in every way that a student in your classroom might need. So they are hearing it, they are seeing it, they are doing hands-on, they're trying it, they're, you know, kinesthetically moving to do it. You're repeating directions, breaking down larger tasks, checking in often for understanding of the directions and the skills needed for the task, providing notes, organizers, exploring assistive tech resources, and only requiring, assessing, and expecting what is necessary to gain knowledge about the student's understanding. This is a big one for many of my students. I've, you know, recently tested a few students who are at the high school level, but reading at a 2nd, 3rd grade level. So what does this look like for them in the classroom, right? So are they expected to know everything in that lesson, in that unit that we're learning? Or can we scale it back to only what's essential for them? So that's really important. And well, I'll get to that after. You know, the testing is, you know, it tells us what their strengths are and what they need and what their reading level is. And often when I am at PPTs after the evaluation and we're talking about what will be on the IEP, what will be the accommodations, what will be the modifications, is I try to always ask, what does that look like, right? Because as a special ed teacher, I've done this myself. Well, oh yes, I'll modify that. We'll modify his work. It'll be okay. But what does that look like, right? So you're going to provide a study guide. Great. What does that study guide look like? Is it pictures? Is it only on the essential information? Is it on everything? Can the student read it, right? How can they use it? Can they do it independently? So really kind of getting down to that nitty gritty of what does that look like for that student in that classroom every single day, and providing extra time, examples, models. My biggest thing with students with dyslexia is, or any disabilities, honestly, is how can knowing if a student has dyslexia change their mindset and ultimately their instruction? And I believe that it's empowerment and advocacy, is that mindset of, wow, okay, I know who I am as a learner and I know what I need and I know how to get it, right? So it's changing their mindset to not, I can't do this, or this is a challenge, but because I am dyslexic, I know these things. These are my strengths, and this is how I learn. So really changing that mindset. And most of the rest of my slides are based on that and just kind of resources. So I'm going to go pretty quick through them. I would argue that children with dyslexia are born to stand out. So why should they be fitting in, right? So let's let them stand out. Let's let them be who they are and be proud of all of the strengths they have. So how can we do this at home? What can we do? Learn about their strengths, areas to focus, help them discover who they are as learners, empower them, teach them how to communicate with their school team, that it's okay to ask a teacher if you can go out in the hall to use your speech to text, encourage self-advocacy, try new strategies. If something's not working, right, our students, as they get older, their needs change. What strategies work for them change as they get into upper grades. The same assistive tech is not going to be the best assistive tech for them anywhere. We're going to have to change it up. Trying new things. All right, well, that's not working, so let's try this. Providing support, providing time and structure, and providing an appropriate team of instructors, advocates, mentors. So giving them the team that they need to be successful. And another cartoon. The consonants seem to know our every move. There must be a double agent among us. And of course, it's the vowel Y, right? Sometimes a vowel, sometimes a consonant. So again, going to, parents, and I know I'm going to jump ahead, but one of the questions that were asked was, how can we support them at home? What do we do as adults if we are dyslexic and we want to help our students? It's knowing what is happening in the classroom, right? What is happening if they have private instruction? What are they learning that week? How are they learning it? What are the strategies? What are the manipulatives they're using? And then you can support them at home when you're reading, when you're doing their homework with them, when you're, working together, you know what they're doing. You know when Y is a vowel and when it is a consonant, and you can support them that way. This is a great link. I suggest clicking on it and talking about it with your student, your child, is, like Larry was saying, is there are so many celebrities and famous people and successful people who are dyslexic. So this goes through a list of people and they say, because I am dyslexic, I am a famous cinematographer, or I am a famous poet, and they kind of go through why they are successful because they are dyslexic. This is a who is dyslexic. It's a list of over 200 famous people, athletes, actresses, actors, inventors, geniuses, Albert Einstein, just a list of 200 well-known people who are dyslexic. And this is someone that I had the pleasure of seeing speak at one of the International Dyslexia Association conferences. His name is Laderick Horn. I would definitely look him up. There's a couple links here for his story and one of his poems. And he grew up in a city and from a very young age was challenged. He said he was subjected to more flashcards than should be allowed by law. And, it's okay to shout from the rooftops that you're different. The human race has benefited tremendously from people who think differently. So again, that mindset. And this is a documentary that he created about being you. And he took 3 young adults on a road trip, and they learned and met people who are dyslexic and who are very successful. And one of the speakers is Pete Denman, who developed the user interface for the communication device that Stephen Hawking used. And his quote in the film is that there's no wheelchair for dyslexia, a social cue to let people know something is different about you. And then the last is Jared S. Blank. His goal is to run until everyone can read. He ran 7 marathons on 7 continents in 7 days, and he is raising awareness for dyslexia. He raised over $50,000 just by, that one time. He was diagnosed at 5, and he said it's going to be really, really hard, just like running with a cut on your foot, but you can do it. So, just my point in these is just that there's so many people out there that have, overcome, they've learned their strategies. And, he said, when you're sitting in a classroom for 8 hours a day and you can't read, it's dreadful. It's painful. People don't understand the impact it has. Even with things in front of you, it's hard. You need belief and empowerment. So if we can empower our students, teach them who they are as learners, then they can do anything, right? We can help them do anything. And then the last slide is just some resources. International Dyslexia Association. I think Attorney Berliner already put the State Department of Ed in the chat. Understood.org has some really great resources for families. This is the ASCD, who puts out the EL magazine, has some amazing articles and research in it. The Reading League I put in, Orton Gillingham and Wilson. And then there is my contact information. So if I went really fast to try to get to the questions and answers, I apologize. But, hopefully the information is here on all of the links. And, I'm happy to answer any questions if you need more detail.
Everybody's going to have access to these slides. It's in the link. And if you have struggled with the link, then you can contact Rachel and we can send out separately. But one question we did receive beforehand, we have an awful lot of parents and households that are bilingual. So for a student that is potentially bilingual or even trilingual in a household, what recommendations do you have for that child when it comes to reading? Should they be learning to read in more than one language? What would your recommendation be?
So I think what's key there is to find someone who is familiar with teaching reading to someone who is bilingual, because while it's the same instruction, it's not, if that makes sense. It's the same instruction, but you really need to dig in really deep to see why they're making those errors. So is it, would they be making these errors in their first language? Or is it just in English that they're making these errors, right? So it's kind of digging in to see where the problem lies. So, the assessment is going to be really important. The assessment, especially into both languages, to see, is it a dyslexia or is it a reading disability or is it just English? So that's the really important thing, even before instruction begins, is to get to that knowledge of their first language and their second language to see. And vocabulary comes in really important when you're working with another language, is learning that vocabulary of English. So I think first is finding the right team.
One of the questions we had is, now that we have all of these assessments completed by either schools or private individuals such as yourself, what do we do with them? Often I will have an evaluation recommending an explicit code-based program of instruction, whether it's Wilson or in Gillingham or some other reading program. And the evaluator will talk about the person having a certain level of credentials in order to deliver the program with fidelity. And then the parents are sort of left, and the student are left high and dry. But we don't do that. This is what's available. What do we do as parents, as educators, as advocates to ensure that results of the testing, such as what you've described, actually show up, every day in school in an IEP in a classroom?
Yeah, and I think developing that IEP is huge. Not all districts have the resources, but there are resources out there. So, as a parent, if I couldn't get it through the school, I would certainly be getting it private and then trying to work that way. But that's not always an option as well. So, it's really trying to build your team, whether it includes, Attorney Berliner or a special ed attorney, an advocate, a private tutor that can kind of do the assessment and advocate for you what those needs are. It's building the team that's really going to support your student and make sure that they're getting what they need.
Quite often parents, and I work with a lot of younger parents, so a lot of the children I work with have speech delays. And the acquisition of language through phonics is a challenge for them. At what point as a parent would you, when you see your child is starting to struggle to read in those basic CVC words, at what point would you start to question or ask the district to examine your child's reading proficiency, or even identifying if dyslexia is prevalent?
I would say as soon as you're asking that question, that's the time. As soon as those red flags pop up, as soon as you have any concerns, that's the time to start collecting data to, whether it's a formal assessment, whether it's an informal assessment, or just reaching out to your school team to say, how are they doing in the classroom? What does that look like? I think collecting that data, is the classroom teacher providing tier 1 intervention? Are they being pulled out and they're in tier 2 and they're receiving that RTI or SRBI? If they're already receiving that, then data is being collected already. But starting that process as soon as possible is collecting data to know if instruction is working or not. If it's not, can we change the instruction? And then if it's still not working, okay, now we need to look a little deeper at formal testing to see if there is in fact something that we need to look deep into.
So Lawrence, this is a question for you, and I think I know the answer, but for those parents that are choosing to do homeschooling, are the school districts then required to do testing for dyslexia for those students within the district but have opted to do homeschooling?
Unfortunately, the answer is no in Connecticut. The answer is yes in some other states, but not Connecticut. In order to be part of what's called Child Find, which is the process of identifying children with suspected disabilities, having referrals to a PPT meeting in Connecticut, that's the IEP meeting, one has to be on the rolls of the school district, registered with the district. And for families who are homeschooling their children, and there are quite a few in Connecticut, quite a few families that is, and there's an association of homeschool students and families in Connecticut as well, they're not able to get school-based assessments. But that doesn't prevent a family going privately to somebody like Susanne, and if they find that the student might benefit from a public school education with an IEP, then they can share the results of that evaluation, ask for a referral to special education, make sure the child is registered with the district, ask for a referral to special education, and then let that process evolve. I want to just do a housekeeping note. We have several questions. A copy of this webinar will be sent to you, and the links and the slides, if they are reproduced on the video, will be sent to you as well. So please be patient with us. You should get it shortly after tonight's webinar. And for somebody who's asked for closed captioning, we deeply apologize. We don't have closed captioning capacity on Zoom, but closed captioning is available on the YouTube video that will accompany the webinar.
So Lawrence, we have another question for you, Susanne, as well. So if a family have identified and they've got the testing to show that their child does have dyslexia, and they go to the district and say, our concern has been validated by these evaluations, which has clarified that there is dyslexia, what expectations should the parents have with the public school at that point to address the concern and the need that their child has? This is for Lawrence. Because again, I think I know the answer, but again, then for you too, Susanne, because you've been the educator in that situation too.
Well, having a disability alone doesn't qualify for special education. It might qualify for what's called a Section 504 plan of accommodations. What the federal special ed law looks at is not only a disability category. In Connecticut, we have 14, dyslexia being the 14th one. We have to look at the adverse impact upon education, and we have to ensure that the child would benefit from the IEP. So it's sort of a three-part definition: disability, adverse impact, and benefit from an IEP. So just having a diagnosis of dyslexia alone doesn't qualify you for special ed. It is almost impossible for me to imagine a child who has undiagnosed dyslexia not having an adverse impact struggling in school. So I think once we have the diagnosis, evaluation of dyslexia, the other two pieces should fall in place.
This is an interesting question or proposition, I should say. So for example, in elementary school, where students are first identified maybe as struggling to acquire reading skills, of which Susanne said there's the 5 pillars of reading. Why do you think it is that elementary schools do not routinely screen for dyslexia as part of their annual testing or part of their basic screening when evaluating children and benchmarking where they're at? Any ideas or suggestions as to why districts don't routinely screen for dyslexia? Either?
Some do. So some do screen, as early as kindergarten, and they are, watching those students that kind of are lacking some early literacy skills, and they're immediately jumping in to provide the support. Not all do, and I can't answer why. I wish I could. I wish I could, make it so that it's an absolute and that it's at every school, because it's so very important for that early intervention. I don't know that I can answer why they don't.
No, it's a resource issue. Some districts are proactive and some are reactive. And unfortunately, we have about 170 school districts in Connecticut, public, regional education, charter schools, whatever. And the resources and the attitudes towards early intervention and identification is not equal throughout all 170 districts. Some, as soon as there's a red flag, they're white on rice, so to speak. Others wait for a very large ditch hole to be dug, then they'll intervene. And in both situations, it's unacceptable to wait. I mean, the school districts that intervene right up front, should be commended, and they should be the model for the rest of the school districts that are reactive.
Susanne, when you're trying to determine which is the best reading program, I know that you are Alton Gillingham trained, but if you are screening a child, you also do evaluations to determine which would be the best reading program?
So for me, it depends on a few things. Some schools, it's what's available, what are teachers trained in. If deciding Orton Gillingham or Wilson, they're both phenomenal for students with dyslexia. For me, it's more about the training. If a school district has a teacher that's trained in, at the 3-day level of Wilson, or an associate at OG, I will pull the OG for that student. Or if it was someone that was just, did a 30-hour online course versus through the academy, there's a big difference, in doing that practicum. So to me, it's about the training. And unfortunately, both are not available at most districts. It's one or the other, if we're lucky, if there's someone trained at the district. So that's usually my go-to, is what do you have that's, who do you have that's trained? What do you have that you can offer this student? They are very similar, and they're both explicit and diagnostic and prescriptive, and they both fit into that structured literacy, and they both follow the science of reading. So
So this is a follow-up for Lawrence. So Lawrence, if you know that your child needs a specific reading program as based on recommendation from someone such as Susanne, or you've done your own research, you understand now there are different programs geared specifically for children with dyslexia, how do you ensure that a district provides you with a program that is actually taught by somebody trained to administer that program or deliver it to the child?
Well, the very first response to that question is ask. Make sure if you're at a PPT meeting, you're asking for the qualifications, the program, the methodology, the credentials of the person in order to ensure that the program is delivered by a qualified person with fidelity, and make sure there's enough time, not in the schedule, but in the school day, to make sure the student will benefit. One of the questions we have is 30 minutes enough? I typically see a minimum of 3/4 of an hour to an hour per day, and sometimes 2 hours a day. We're teaching towards the child's individual and unique needs, not what's available in the schedule. So parents need to be proactive and understand if they have an evaluation from the school, or more specifically, private evaluators who say the person has to have this level of credentials. The program is X or Y or Z, and it should be done for a minimum of so many minutes per day. With fidelity, the fidelity part is what Susanne talked about, the data collection, making sure before we move to the next level, we've mastered what we need to learn at the current level. The problem is the school districts will often say that our teachers are certified, which they all are. In order to work in a public school setting, you have to be certified by the State Department of Education. The question, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way, the question is, are they qualified? And that's where, one of the things, I'll share a little bit about Susanne. One of the things that impressed me when she was a teacher on her own, she was getting that training in Orton Gillingham when she realized she didn't have enough as a certified teacher to help students with language-based, reading disabilities. And if there was a way to clone that attitude of Susanne and have it, in all the other districts, I think we would see, the question is, what are we as a society losing when we're not properly preparing the next generation to take their rightful place in society because they don't know how to read, or they can't do math, or they can't spell, all the basic skills? Are we losing the next Albert Einstein? Are we losing, the next David Boies? Are we losing the next Charles Schwab? There will be a penalty that we pay as a society by not educating our young children early on and ensuring that they have the foundational skills they need for each next step in their life. And and when we see the future, and I'm going back to Susanne talked about the science of reading. That's the future. We finally put together, I think it was about 100,000 articles that the National Reading Panel digested to come up with these 5 principles of reading. Well, here we are. We understand scientifically, educationally, neurologically what dyslexia is, and we're still learning about it. And there'll be new approaches as we move forward. There's a lot of research going on here in Connecticut, at UConn, at Yale, elsewhere, on the science of reading. There's a medical team looking at the medical aspects of reading disabilities, the testing, the measurements, best practices in a classroom setting. All of these things are important to make sure that we have our children properly prepared for preschool to elementary school to middle school to high school, and beyond high school, to make sure that they will take their rightful place in society. So unfortunately, there's not a single answer, but for me, it starts with the parents understanding their child. It starts with the parents doing their research, reading, going to seminars like tonight, reading articles that Suzanne has mentioned, calling Jules McComb Tolis once she gets settled in her new job and find out what resources are out there. And another piece is parent training, which is a related service in an IEP. Because we touched upon this earlier, what can I do as a parent to help my child at home? Well, if you don't have the answer to that question, parent training is a related service. Maybe I can be taught to deliver a home-based program of reading instruction, such as homework time, or when we're told that, read a book over the summer and my child can't read, well, I can be there to support my child. So there's no single answer, but there are answers out there.
Quite often I meet parents in 2nd or 3rd grade at the point at which they are concerned about their child's literacy. And to some of them, it has come as a surprise that their child is struggling with reading to the extent to which they are, despite the fact the child is now in 2nd or 3rd grade. Are there things that parents can be doing at home when a child is younger to look out for some of these red flags? So if their child is gravitating towards book and is interested in books, some parents feel, oh, they're enjoying reading. But so what strategies, Susanne, do you have for parents to do their own exploration? They're not going to do an evaluation because they're not trained or certified. But what exploration can they do to address maybe some of the intuition that's telling them that's a concern, to help them with confidence go and then raise the red flag or ask the question at school for an evaluation?
There's so much I want to say to that. I think reading, having them read to you, are they reading the words? Are they just following along and following the picture, but not really reading the words and just making up a story? Which initially for very early readers, that's appropriate. But how long are they doing that, right? Are they having a trouble decoding the words and they're just looking at the first letter and picking a word that starts with that letter? Or are they actually reading the words? When they are reading the words, are they comprehending? Stop at every page and ask a question. What did we just read about? What did they just do? So do they understand what they're reading? So, that's the first part. Are they rhyming? Do they know their letters at the very early stage? So really just kind of finding, those 5 pillars of reading is, are they meeting expectations there? I mean, as a parent, you may not know those expectations, but you get a gut feeling, right? You get like, I don't know, my first child was reading at this time, this one's not. Is this something I should be concerned at? And it doesn't have to be, like I said, a huge formal evaluation right off the bat. We might collect data. We might talk to their teachers. There are several students that have come to me, families, homeschool families, that say, there might be something, can you just take a look? And it's not a formal evaluation, but I'll do one session with them and I'll kind of do some quick informal, we'll read together and I'll just do a quick look and just give them suggestions. These are some gaps that I see, try to work on this. So again, it comes down to building your team, like Attorney Berliner said, is gathering that information, getting those resources, clicking on the links that we put in the slideshow and in the chat. And just learn as much as you can to see if those red flags, those gut feelings are warranted.
We had a couple of questions that came in this evening. What happens when a special education teacher is not qualified or trained in evidence-based curriculum, or not trained in the programs that help students with dyslexia? And that, as I mentioned before, is a resource problem. And I would encourage families to go to their local Board of Education meetings and get this on the agenda, because the board on a local level will control the allocation of resources. So if we have to hire a reading teacher or hire a consultant to train the teachers, that can happen on the local level. The state has resources, but we're not, as I said, Jules Tolis is going to be one person in the Bureau. She has to leverage those resources with 170 school districts and thousands of families and children. So it's important that families be proactive by getting this issue before your local Board of Education, which controls the agenda, the purse strings on the local level. And I know one school district, parents kept lobbying the local district and they established a reading academy. Is it perfect? No, but it's a good starting point, and it gives something for parents to coalesce around to make it better, to make it more demand responsive, to have more qualified staff. And the only reason it's happening is that old adage, the squeaky wheel got the grease. So please squeak out there. I don't know if Suzanne wants to add to that.
I would say definitely squeak, because the squeaky wheel definitely gets the grease. So it's important. Yeah, I mean, we have to teach our children to advocate, but we also need to advocate. So, and, you know, don't worry about being that parent, because when those parents come to me, I have very much respect for them, and you're taking care of your child. And that's, you know, our job as parents. So I've been that parent and I've been that teacher. So, you know, in my saying, I don't know if this is appropriate or not, but my saying is always, if someone is going to fire me for advocating for a child, then so be it, because that's why we all do this. That's why we're here. That's why we're here as parents, as educators, is we want to provide what is appropriate for students. What we're going to give them is going to make them successful. So however we need to do that, let's do it.
And parents are sometimes reluctant to explore an evaluation because they don't want a label and a diagnosis for their child. But I would highly recommend that it's really important to understand why your child is struggling with reading, and not to be concerned that if that means that they are then diagnosed with dyslexia, to avoid that evaluation. I would embrace it for the resources and the appropriate education it can then provide your child with, and the information that can be then used by the team of educators working with your child in the district, because it doesn't just impact English literacy skills, it impacts social studies, it impacts mathematics, when children are decoding mathematic problems and reading math problems, and a lot more problems, particularly in the younger grades, are written as opposed to just pure numerical problems. So it's really important to embrace it and then use that information to tailor the child's program to give them an appropriate free public education. Lawrence, do you have anything to add on that?
No, it's well said. I do want to just point out that I think, unfortunately, we've come to an appointed hour that we need to start wrapping up. I apologize. We apologize that we haven't gotten to each and every question. We had quite a number of questions that came in this evening on top of the dozens and dozens that came in prior to this evening. Maybe we should have a second round with Susanne, if she would be willing to grace her presence, and we can continue this conversation, really a dialogue. So I want to thank everybody who's been on the webinar this evening. As I mentioned before, you will be getting a copy of this, and hopefully the slides and the links on Suzanne's slides will show up. You have her contact information. If I'm incorrect. So Jane and I will be continuing our Zoom webinars through the balance of this school year. We are in the process of planning our next webinar, which we believe will be on January 10th, and this will be a roundtable discussion with advocates, Ali Grafman and Marla Wayne. Jane and I will be participating in the webinar. Our title at this point is The New Year Matters, and we're going to make a resolution to advocate for our children's progress and their educational future. And this is critically important after the year, because a lot of times we have the annual review, the end of the year PPT meetings as we are reviewing the 22-23 school year and planning for the 23-24 school year. So I hope people will join us. We will be putting some information out to register. We don't have that just yet. So we will be doing that. And that leads to my final two remarks. One, I want to thank my daughter, Rachel, for her efforts to put this together. She's off to my immediate right, off camera, helping me, such as reminding me Susanne is in Madison, not Guilford, for her office. And being in touch with all of you who've registered, and after this webinar, getting you a copy of the recording. The next thing I want to say in conclusion, I want to thank Susanne for her professionalism, her dedication each and every day that she gets up and helps families and children who are struggling with the basics of reading. And I want to thank her for her time this evening and sharing her expertise, wisdom, and experience. And with that, Jane, and then Susanne, if you have any final comments, please offer those as well.
No, I'd just like to thank you, Lawrence, again, and Susan for joining us tonight. This is such an important topic. I think even more prevalent since COVID, since parents have been able to see when they were the educators at home with their children, they understand the struggles that their children are having with reading and literacy. It's not something that you should sit upon, as Susanne said. If you have an intuition or feeling that they're struggling, explore it. There's no harm in doing an exploration and finding out if there is a need that needs to be addressed. In the meantime, I hope everybody has a lovely holiday. Check out our JumpStar's Facebook page or Instagram. We do things socially to connect everybody engaged within the community. We have, I think it's like a paint and sit next Friday, located at the Star premises at Norwalk at Wolf Pit, where you can come and congregate with other like-minded parents that might be going through a similar journey to yourself. If you need any support with your child, obviously reach out to Lawrence or myself, and Susanne if you want her to help you explore any challenges or struggles your child might be having with reading. It might not just be dyslexia. There are other reading concerns that Susanne could address or maybe highlight and identify for you and with your child. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, Susanne.
Yes, my pleasure. And any small question, big question, please feel free to reach out. That's why I do this, is that I want to support families and students. And so, even if it's a quick question, please feel free to email for any support that I can offer, or just where do I find something, what resources are available. But happy to help.
I just want to say too that we don't just have parents on this webinar, we sometimes have educators watching. If you're an educator and you are concerned and you feel that you don't have the expertise, don't be shy to reach out to experts such as Susanne to help inform yourself, because any knowledge that you can gain on reading and exploring dyslexia and these things, don't be shy to reach out to the experts like Susanne in the field. I'm sure that they'd be happy to share with like-minded professionals as well.
Always. I could talk forever. And collaboration is key, right? To the school team, to the families. It's, that collaboration is so crucial. So I can talk to any educator, any parent at any time.
Very well said, and very well said that we wish everybody a safe, healthy, and happy holiday season. I know sometimes it's very difficult this time of year, but we will, get through this holiday season, and we'll see everybody after the first of the year.
Thank you. Good night.